So I want you to imagine that you're Russian and that you're driving and pulling into a petrol station somewhere in Moscow this week. Not in Crimea and not in some remote regional area near the front lines or, say, Rostov-on-Don. You're in Moscow and suddenly you're being told that you can only buy up to 20 litres. That's it. You have to come back tomorrow. Now that is happening everywhere in Russia's capital city. And it's been happening across 53 Russian regions or oblasts simultaneously. Rationing, cubes, caps per customer, plenty of closed pumps, and of course, price rises. All of that happening right now in a country that sits on one of the largest oil reserves on the planet. But to make it worse, this week we also found out that it's going to get considerably worse, because the refinery that supplies 40% of Moscow's fuel, the one Ukraine has struck twice this month already, is now going to be offline for at least 6 months, half a year. That's the assessment from various industrial sources. So that's 6 months, which means going into winter. And then, simultaneously, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov saying in front of reporters, and I want you to keep this thought in your mind, that Russia's macroeconomic stability is absolutely secured and is not a matter of doubt for anyone. So, that gap between what is happening for the average Russian at petrol stations across Russia right now and what the Kremlin is saying about it, well, tells you everything you need to know about the real state of Russia's economy. This is the Global Gambit. Now, those of you who are regulars on the show will know that I try to be balanced or try to draw from a diverse array of perspectives when covering geopolitical issues. And that includes being from, say, the more conventional Western perspectives, but also the non-Western perspectives and narratives, because it's important to expose ourselves to as many angles as possible, even if we don't agree with them. And this is important in the context of what happens with Russia, Ukraine, and most specifically the topic of this video, Crimea, and the continued strikes undermining Russian energy. Now, before getting into it, what do you guys think? How do you look at these fuel shortages, and how much a bigger deal do you think they are in individual cases? Now, let's establish the scale of what Ukraine has actually been doing to Russia's refining capacity, because this has been building for months at this point, and the Moscow refinery story is the latest chapter. Since the start of this year, Ukraine has been systematically targeting Russian oil infrastructure, not randomly, but very, very systematically, with a gradual escalation ladder, you could argue, from refineries to fuel terminals, storage facilities, pipelines, to supply routes. In May alone, Ukraine struck Russian oil refineries 16 times, a record for the whole war. More than 10 additional strikes hit pipelines, depots, and ports in the same month. The cumulative result is that Ukrainian strikes have knocked out facilities that account for around 25%, a quarter of Russian total refining capacity, and more than 30% of its gasoline output. By contrast, Russia's oil production in May fell to 8.7 million barrels per day. That's roughly 100,000 barrels below target. But at the same time, defense spending was up by 30% in the first quarter compared to the same period last year. And whilst it was meant to actually fall to 7.8%, it was on track to reach 10%. So on the one hand, we have a country that is requiring more and more military capacity and funding for it, but a smaller and smaller set of income to do that with. And now the Moscow refinery, the single largest supplier for the Russian capital, which processes around 11.5 million metric tons of oil annually, is offline for at least half a year. Now, the rationing didn't start in Moscow, of course. It started, as so many Russian war problems do, on the front lines and has worked inward and backwards. Now, Crimea is critical here, because Crimea has seen some of the strictest gasoline rationing of anywhere, with authorities introducing hard caps and vouchers in late May. But it spread from there. 6 Russian regions, Minsk, Irkutsk, Saratov, Voronezh, Amur, and Tabov, introduced strict limits on fuel sales, caps of 30 litres per person, 40, 60 perhaps if you're lucky, but it heavily depends on not just the oblast, but the actual specific station. There were fuel sale limits introduced in Russian-occupied oblasts of Ukraine, including Zaporizhia and Donetsk. Even those on the front line are seeing limitations. But then it reached St. Petersburg and then Moscow. Rationing reached the principal urban centers, where the Tatneft chain began limiting customers to 20 litres of petrol and 40 litres of diesel. Rosneft stations introducing rations of around 95 litres per customer, and independent reports have suggested that in 53 regions and in Ukraine it has been even half of that. Just stop on that number. 53 regions. Russia has 89 federal subjects, so Ukraine's drone campaign has produced fuel rationing in more than half of them, to the point Russia has now banned diesel exports entirely through again to July to try to stabilize domestic supply. The domestic prime minister is publicly discussing an incomplete diesel export ban, and the government is reportedly considering importing fuel, that's importing it, to tackle shortages in Crimea, where civilian petrol has been suspended entirely with no time horizon as to when it might be switched on again. But then this is where it gets particularly revealing. The Kremlin's response to all of this has followed a pattern so consistent it's almost mechanical. Just deny it, minimize, try to attribute it to other causes. I mentioned in a previous video about unexpected interferences or unexpected servicing delays. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, told reporters just earlier this week that Russia's macroeconomic stability is absolutely secured and is not a matter of doubt for anyone. Now, while he acknowledged that global energy markets are volatile, that is a global problem and not something related to Russia's internal issues, or more specifically, a consequence of Ukraine's growing campaign. Now, regional governors have been racing to tell their respective residents there are no shortages, while simultaneously announcing these rationing measures. Damage control without decent narrative. The governor of Leningrad region, for example, said supplies are being delivered according to plan and that there are no shortages at all. Meanwhile, stations in his region are capping purchases at 50 litres. Putin himself has made a rare concession that Ukraine has been making that economic pain, acknowledging his infamous and global standing place of the International Economic Forum, whilst drone strikes decimated the city. And then he immediately added, everything is fine because it's recovering quickly. The Moscow refinery will be offline for at least 6 months. Putin says everything is quickly recovering, but sort of those two don't really go together. And gasoline production in 2026 is estimated to be roughly 10, even 15% lower than the whole of last year. Now, the fuel crisis doesn't exist in isolation. It's one symptom of something much larger happening to Russia's economy right now. Russia's federal budget is facing a revenue shortfall of about 2.1 trillion rubles. That's about $28 billion, which is driven by a multitude of things, but including weaker corporate profits, the fall in crude prices, and a stronger ruble. The brief windfall from the Iran conflict in the past 3 or so months, where Russia's benchmark Urals crude peaked at around $120 a barrel, is over. The price is tumbling and in some cases has been as low as $65 per barrel this week. Therefore, the budget deficit has already blown past 6 trillion rubles in just the first 5 months of this year. Russia is also spending more on defense than at any other point in the war. The Kremlin promised to cut military spending this year, but it's actually heading for 10% GDP, and therefore the civilian economy, the part that keeps ordinary Russians employed, housed, and able to fill their cars or their families fed, is being systematically starved of resources to feed that war machine component that is simultaneously having its output destroyed by Ukrainian drones. The stock market has fallen more than 4 to its lowest level in more than 3 years. and it's been declining for about 15 consecutive weeks, mind you. Then, of course, there's been the very unusual disappearance of the central bank governor. Indeed, the central bank's interest rate was cut last week instead of reassuring investors, signaling that high borrowing costs will persist much longer than expected. So none of this, if you step back, you don't have to be an economist, looks like an economy that is recovering quickly. It looks like an economy that is being squeezed simultaneously from multiple directions. The rising military costs, the falling energy revenues, declining refining capacity, and a currency and market that reflect all of the above. But here's the thing about fuel shortages that makes them politically different from other macroeconomic problems. You see, food price inflation is invisible until you're at the checkout. Interest rates are abstract, but queues at petrol stations, caps on how much you can physically buy, notices on pumps saying that they're closed, those are visceral, immediate, personal. Every driver in 53 Russian regions is now encountering the consequences of this war in a way that cannot be explained away by state television, much as they tried with the strikes on Moscow last week. Putin has spent 4 years insulating the Russian population from the costs of this war. He has managed the inflation, subsidized fuel prices significantly, paid soldiers enormous bonuses, and kept the lights on in Moscow. The geographic and economic buffer between the average Russian and the front line has been one of his most important political tools. But that buffer is eroding. While rationing is being introduced at some gas stations, prices remain largely unchanged, suggesting the government is still absorbing some of this pain through subsidies. But there remains some capacity to increase imports of petroleum products from, say, Belarus, though the gains from these measures are unlikely to fully offset the continuing decline in refining capacity, especially if the war continues for a year, possibly more. The options, what are most important though, are shrinking. And the Moscow refinery being offline for 6 months means the pressure doesn't ease over the summer. It gets worse, and it only gets worse even more as we enter the fall, we enter the winter, and generally the overall sentiment of the Russian population towards Putin, when they say 80% give him approval, but only 30% actually trust him, shows that ultimately this is a declining situation for the Kremlin. Dmitry Peskov stood in front of those reporters and said that Russia's macroeconomic stability is absolutely fine. But on the same day, drivers are being turned away, and the costs at the fuel pumps do not reflect that. The country's largest fuel supplier to its capital confirmed that it will be offline for 6 months, and defense spending running at nearly double the target as a share of GDP. The budget deficit as a whole blowing past previous projections in just 5 months, and the stock market at a 3-year low after 15 consecutive weeks of overall decline. It's these gaps between the Russian claims or the Russian government's suggestions and the Russian realities for many people. That gap has always existed, but it's never been as wide and overt as this. And it's never been so obvious to especially foreign observers, but most specifically ordinary Russians, who are those sitting in the queues or looking at the shops and wandering around wondering whether this war really is coming back to bite them more than they perhaps thought. Indeed, Ukraine's drone campaign is not just hitting refineries, it's hitting the story Russia tells about itself. And 6 months from now, when that Moscow refinery is still offline, that story is going to be even harder to tell. But that's it from me, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then do give it a like, and of course subscribe for more what I attempt to be as balanced takes. And check out these videos on screen now for more on Russia, the Ukraine war, and of course many interviews with top tier guests. Speak soon. Hey guys, just wanted to drop a quick note to say that I tried something a little bit different in this video, presentation style and a couple of other things. So drop a comment below if you enjoyed it. Let me know if you think there's any particular ways or something that you particularly enjoy in previous videos that I've done. As the community continues to grow, I'm all about trying to improve the style, the content and everything. So yeah, thanks a lot and see you in the next one.